The Baltimore Ravens desperately need to make big changes during the 2023 offseason. We talk about what those changes should be, continuing to recap Baltimore's 24-17 loss in the wildcard round to the Bengals. We'll talk about what the players had to say during their locker cleanouts and more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of Locked On Ravens. We are your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, and I'm your host, Kevin Ostreicher of Ravens Wire. We're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And thank you so much for being with us here today, tuning in and making us your first listen of the day here on Locked On Ravens. Free and available, as always, in all podcasting platforms, also in video form on YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On Ravens is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times the money on an entry. First-time users can receive an 100% deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com. Promo code Locked On, and we are back. It is day 2 of the Ravens offseason as they lose to Cincinnati 24-17. That ends their season. So just because Baltimore's season is over does not mean that we stop here on Locked On Ravens. We're 5 days a week all the way through. On Friday, it'll actually be my 900th consecutive episode of Locked On Ravens, dating back to 2019 before that season started. So we still do 5 days a week during the offseason. So be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It is free. It is also free to follow along in audio form, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We do Ravens updates, Ravens analysis, Ravens news, all things Ravens, Monday through Friday. And here today, we're going to be talking about the Ravens and the changes they need to make, because there's been a lot. I'll say the word. I'll say it. Complacency. It's complacency for the Ravens, and they need to get out of that. They need to make changes to elevate their offense, to elevate their time management, to elevate their play calling. There's a lot. So we'll talk about some of the changes I personally think Baltimore should and honestly needs to make during this 2023 offseason. So it'll kind of be like a mini offseason preview, I guess. And then in the second segment, we'll be moving into what the players had to say during their locker cleanout, some talk about Lamar Jackson, the wild card game, just looking ahead to next season. There were a lot of good tidbits in there, so we'll talk about that. And then in the final segment, we'll move into more of a what do the Ravens need, not necessarily change-wise, but where should they be looking to improve? What can they take away from this season as they look ahead to the future and more? So kind of like an all-encompassing overview of the Ravens in that final segment. So let's first talk about the changes. When I'm talking about changes for the Ravens, I think the number one thing many people go to, and so I will go to that. I will dip into that well. It is Greg Roman. I do think, and again, opinion, this is nothing I've heard or anything, but I'd be pretty floored if Baltimore didn't move on from Greg Roman at this stage. And again, that's, not news or anything. It's just something that, my gut feeling tells me that, Baltimore, it would make a lot of sense for them to move on from Greg Roman right now. It feels like there was pushback from John Harbaugh. At least it felt that way to me. I don't know if anybody else felt that way, but it felt like there was pushback from John Harbaugh throughout this season, especially like in the mid to late season, about some of the things Greg Roman was doing, some of the things Greg Roman was responsible for. And we all know the reasons. We all understand the strengths and the weaknesses of Greg Roman. Roman orchestrated, obviously, one of the most historic offenses in NFL history during that 2019 season, but it's been a lot of the same, not evolving based off of that offense. And in turn, it has led to kind of a stale product on the field, something we shouldn't even be thinking about when you have a player like Lamar Jackson. The words Lamar Jackson, his name, and the word stale shouldn't even be in the same sentence, in the same paragraph. And it just feels like there wasn't much evolution from that Greg Roman offense in terms of the play calling, a lot of stale play calling. But at the same time, Roman is, I don't think, a bad offensive coordinator. I just think the Ravens have outgrown him and they should move on. They should get to an offense where if Lamar Jackson does come back, and it's a question in its own right, but if Lamar Jackson does come back, which I'm hoping he will, the Ravens can evolve the offense and make it cater it, I'd say, to Lamar Jackson's overall strength, not just as a runner, but as a passer. He is a good passer, and I feel like he needs to have the opportunity to spread his wings. So if the Ravens were to move on, I would hope that Baltimore looks to outside the organization. I know there's been a lot of controversy surrounding some of Baltimore's recent hires in terms of just staying within the organization and not really branching out and finding somebody. So instead of maybe a James Urban or a T. Martin, I would personally like them to go outside the organization and find an offense where you can spread out 4 wide receivers. And that doesn't even have to be 4 wideouts. You can put Mark Andrews in the slot. You can put Isaiah Likely in the slot. And I know a lot of the conversation around an offensive coordinator would be, well, the Ravens clearly built the team for a Greg Roman type offense where you have the heavy personnel. You sign Patrick Ricard to a deal. What are you going to do? You got to reshape the offense a little bit, not necessarily the whole way. Yes, to an extent, but I think the Ravens can still utilize 3 tight ends. They can still go to heavy packages. They don't have to abandon a run-first style even. They don't have to be an air raid offense or anything like that. But I just feel like a more balanced effort and a play caller that, we're not having play clock issues if you're the Ravens. We're not having different personnel groupings where you're wondering, why is this guy on the field and why is this guy not? So for me, I think moving on from Greg Roman is something. And, the Ravens moved on from Cam Cameron during that Super Bowl year. They were 9-4. And I can't remember who tweeted out the video, but John Harbaugh explained it. And he said, it was just, they were going down a road they knew they couldn't go down anymore, and they had to make a change. It was something along those lines. And I feel like now for the Ravens, they have an opportunity to make a change and make, moving on to a different offensive coordinator is a big change, but it's just one that I feel like is honestly probably a little overdue and one that they need to make this offseason. And another change I would like to see is the Ravens actually invest big money into a wide receiver. Now, again, a lot of this, it hinges on Lamar Jackson. Will Jackson be back? Will it be on a franchise tag if he is? Will there be a long-term extension if he's back? A lot of that hinges on that. But at the same time, we've seen the Ravens invest the draft capital on wide receivers under Lamar Jackson. Marquise Brown in the first round, Rashad Bateman in the first round, Miles Boykin and Devin Duvernay were third rounders, Tylan Wallace in the fourth round. They invest that draft capital, but free agency-wise, there was not a lot of urgency. Eric DeCosta, I can't even remember what offseason it was, but he said that, he was insulted by the fact that people didn't believe in the Ravens wide receivers or something along those lines. He didn't bring in a veteran until DeMarcus Robinson in that 2022 offseason. He decided to trust the young guys. The team decided to go out there and trust the young guys, which was fine in theory. Like you're saying, hey, you know what? We have all these young guys. We're going to give them playing time, whatever. Which, again, you look at it, you're saying, okay, like I get it. But at the same time, you couldn't be in a situation for your Baltimore. You already were on thin ice in terms of, you couldn't lose anybody. That would have just sunk you. The Ravens lost their top 2 guys in Rashad Bateman and Devin Duvernay. If I'm the Ravens, I'm trying to bring in a DeAndre Hopkins. I'm trying to bring in a Brandon Cooks. At the very least, I'm trying to sign maybe a Juju Smith-Schuster or a DJ Chark or Jacoby Myers. Maybe go out there and get Al Lazard. Can you make a move for an Adam Thielen? There are options out there. I think this is the offseason, and especially if Lamar Jackson does come back, if you bring in a number 1, even if it's a mid-tier or low-end wide receiver 1, you can move Rashad Bateman to a high-end wide receiver 2 role, which I think he would flourish in for a couple years, and I think he actually can evolve into a wide receiver 1 during the peak of his career, absolutely. But you can have that even, mid to low tier wide receiver 1. You can have a Rashad Bateman wide receiver 2, a Devin Duvernay wide receiver 3. You can bring back DeMarcus Robinson. You can have Tylan Wallace in there if you want to. There are options for the Ravens. I think that they should honestly bring in 2 veterans. I think they should bring in that number 1 and then also maybe a number 3/4 type player. Just give the weapons. Again, money's a big factor in this. You can't just say, well, we're going to just put together a fantasy team and that's it. You have to understand that some positions aren't going to have the capital, whether it's money or draft capital, allocated to them as opposed to others for the Ravens. But I do think this is the offseason that Baltimore should go out there and get really a star wide receiver. And then for me, I think another big change, I guess I'll go top 3 biggest changes for me. Another change that I'd like to see from the Ravens is kind of a revamp of that cornerback room. The Ravens they lost cornerback talent last offseason. They lost Anthony Averett to the Raiders and Tavon Young went to the Bears, and, not necessarily saying like they lost all pro guys or anything, but they then, move Brandon Stevens up. They put him at corner. They draft Jalen Armour-Davis and Pepe Williams. They have Darius Washington in there. They use Darrell Worley. But Marcus Peters is a player that if he is back in Baltimore, it would have to probably be on a very, very team-friendly deal. And, maybe that's the route. I would not be shocked if that's what happens. It feels like Peters wants to be in Baltimore. And I wouldn't hate Peters as a third cornerback. Maybe that's a hot take. You don't have to play him in all these certain situations. You can manage his snap count, manage his workload, manage the situations that he's in. I would not mind Marcus Peters in like a Jimmy Smith third corner role where he's not playing 90 or 100% of snaps. But I do think you have to bring in a star number 2 guy to be next to Marlon Humphrey. I think if you can have a cornerback room of Marlon Humphrey, I personally believe the Ravens should take a corner in the first round. So let's just dream Joey Porter Jr. gets there. If you have Marlon Humphrey, Joey Porter Jr., Marcus Peters, you can put Brandon Stevens in that category, Jaron Umber-Davis, Pepe Williams. I think that is a better corner room. Or maybe you draft that high-end 2 guy like a Joey Porter Jr., and you bring in a veteran who can kind of double as maybe a 3 or a 4. And then you also then have the young guys of Jalen Umber-Davis and Pepe Williams. I just think for the Ravens, it would have been a disaster if Humphrey went down for any long period of time. I just feel like, in this day and age, especially for the Ravens who have invested in the position before, I mean, they gave Humphrey nearly $100 million. They gave Marcus Peters around $40 million. So I think they're willing to do it, but where is how you don't have a ton of money if you're going to sign Lamar Jackson to this long-term extension. It depends how it's structured and where are the guarantees and is it front loaded or back loaded. But I do think for me, top 3 changes would be an ideal offseason kind of change list. New offensive coordinator, bring in a star wide receiver, revamp that corner room. I think those are the changes. And there are other minor ones along the way that I can kind of point to. But for me, those are the big ones that I have on my checklist for the Ravens. So coming up in our second segment, we'll be diving into what the players had to say to the media during their locker cleanouts. We'll talk about Lamar Jackson and the comments made about him, some of the looking ahead to the future that the players did, and more coming up next here on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, and we are in full fantasy basketball swing right now. I'm off to a good start this week, and I am hoping it continues that way. But if you want a different twist on fantasy, you should check out PrizePicks. It's super easy to use. You can make tons and tons of current entries, and you can win a lot of money. That's a pretty big bonus. And how it works is you pick 2 to 5 players, and if they go score more or less in their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times the amount on your entry. There's no competing against other people. It's a Z-Burst projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch, including the NFL, the NBA, the MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, college basketball, and more. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. Is that easy? They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they're currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. Download the PrizePicks app or go to PrizePicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive an 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Some get the promo code Locked On and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. We return here, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you. Thank you so much again for tuning in with us, making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe, follow along in audio form as well, and make your second listen Locked On NFL. I host a Monday show over on Locked On NFL. We talk with local experts from across our network. So for yesterday's show, we talked about Brandon Staley. We talked about the 49ers and Brock Purdy. We also got into the Giants and that big win for Don Martindale, who's getting the head coaching interview with the Indianapolis Colts. So maybe another former Ravens coach is a head coach in the NFL here. But let's talk about the Ravens and what these players had to say to the media. Locker cleanout day is always, it's a sad day, unless you win the Super Bowl, and then it's fun. But the Ravens had a bunch of players in there. They spoke to the media, and they had some good insight. Mark Andrews, and a lot of it came, talking about Lamar Jackson. They looked ahead to the future, uncertainty with futures for certain players. So with Mark Andrews, he talked about Lamar Jackson. He said, I hope that he's going to be back. That's my guy. I have nothing but love for number 8. And you have Calais Campbell being highly supportive of Lamar Jackson. And he said that wasn't for a lack of effort that Lamar Jackson didn't return. Campbell said that he even rehabbed with Lamar Jackson, and Jackson was working hard. You have Marlon Humphrey saying that, he was limping around the facility, and that, people don't really get to see that. And so he wasn't necessarily surprised that Lamar didn't play against the Bengals, but it just provides that other insight. So to me, it feels like the locker room has Lamar Jackson's back. I know there was a lot of controversy about, does him not traveling with the team mean that, he's falling out with his teammates or something like that. The locker room, it feels like, does fully support Lamar in his recovery, in his endeavors, and wants him to be back. I mean, Mark Andrews and Marlon Humphrey both said they want him to be back for the long haul. Marlon Humphrey talking about how he hopes the Jackson is a Raven with him for a very long time. And it's something to me where it just feels like some of these players might make a decision based off of Lamar. For Calais Campbell, are you coming back to a Ravens team that has uncertainty at quarterback in terms of, is it going to be a draft pick? Are you going to bring in like a bridge player? If you're coming back for your 16th season, Calais Campbell deserves to compete for a Super Bowl ring. I think the Ravens are Super Bowl contenders if they can make the right changes. Let me put it that way, because they have to change things if they want to get to that tier. But I think they have the potential to be Super Bowl contenders just plain outright if Lamar Jackson comes back. So would Calais Campbell come back to Baltimore if Jackson's not there? Would Justin Houston, who said he wants to continue playing, or it'd be ideal for him to continue playing, would he come back to the Ravens if there's no Lamar Jackson and they kind of enter that who's the quarterback type deal? So it was I think it was refreshing to hear these guys talk about their quarterback that way. And honestly, there are some people who are saying, well, what are they going to say? Are they going to go out there and they're going to bash Lamar? What are they going to say to the media? Well, they could just say, yeah, we'll see what happens with him, and that's that. They don't have to go into these details. Maybe some players do go through the whole player speak thing with the media. I get that and I understand it, but I thought it was a positive sign, at least, that the players were supportive of Lamar throughout that whole thing. And speaking of Campbell, he did say that he's not ready to make a decision on his future yet, but he said he hasn't discounted potentially returning. It feels like, honestly, based off of Campbell's answers throughout the whole availability, that he honestly had more issues in terms of deciding his future last year. It's very fresh, so he still has a lot of time, and it's a hard decision. Campbell's somebody who's still playing very well, but obviously this would be his 16th season, so he deserves, any decision he makes has the respect of me. I'm going to respect whatever decision he makes. It'd be super cool if he were to come back, but it felt like the itch is still there for him, at least based off what I picked up. Maybe he retires, I don't know, but it felt like Campbell does want to return. He's talked about how much getting 100 sacks means to him. He fell just short of that for his career this season. So if I had to give a gut feeling, my gut feeling is he comes back for one more season and then retires after next year. But we'll see. Whatever happens is his decision, and I will fully respect it, as everybody should, because he's earned it. He's had such an incredible career. Chuck Clark talked a little bit. He did say that there is uncertainty in terms of whether he returns to the Ravens. He plans to have some of those conversations in the coming weeks, he said, but he said ideally he would like to return. Chuck Clark is a really interesting one for me. I still think Chuck Clark provides value for the Ravens in his role, but I think it comes down to whether Clark wants to be more of that player that there aren't Marcus Williams and Kyle Hamilton's in that secondary, where it's the kind of three-headed monster. And Hamilton's role varied throughout the year, where it wasn't like he was taking all these snaps away from Chuck Clark. They were playing him all over the field, playing him in the big nickel role. So I still think Clark, if he does come back, has a role, and has a really prominent one on the Ravens defense. But it just comes down to what Clark wants, honestly. And we've seen the Ravens do good by their guys, namely Hayden Hurst and Marquise Brown and Orlando Brown Jr. That if those guys want out, they get them out. And so if Chuck Clark says, hey, this has been great, but I want a new opportunity, then I think the Ravens would honor that. There's been a lot of conversation about J.K. Dobbins on, obviously, his comments after the game on Sunday night, where he said that, he's the guy, he wants the ball, and I don't blame him whatsoever. Dobbins had one touch inside the 5-yard line. It was a touchdown. He had a catch for a touchdown and then didn't get the ball inside the 5 again. And he said that, Tyler Huntley shouldn't have been in that situation to where he needs to make the decision to go high or go low, because he's, and he wasn't throwing shade at Tyler Huntley. He was doing none of that. He's uber competitive. You could sense the passion, sense the frustration. And I agree. J.K. Dobbins deserves to have the ball. J.K. Dobbins has had a game of over 15 carries just one time in his career, and it happened a few weeks ago. I've said it a lot of times, but I keep saying it because to me, it's ridiculous with the way that he has played and he has performed. He is someone who is dynamic with the ball in his hands, both as a runner and as a receiver. So I don't know. I think that for Dobbins, he has the right to be frustrated. And this isn't the first time he has kind of spoken out well, not to this extent. He was, he clearly spoke out and said some things, and he wasn't made available to the media on Monday. Neither was Lamar Jackson. He wasn't there, but I think Dobbins has a right to be frustrated, and Dobbins does deserve a bigger role on this offense moving forward, regardless of who the offensive coordinator is. Dobbins is that talented of a player. And so coming up in our final segment, we'll continue talking about that point of conversation. We'll also talk a little bit about that Ravens and Bengals game, what they can take away from that moving into next year and more. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a lot to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is sponsored by BetOnline, and BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to basketball. They've got it all over at BetOnline. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head over to the website today or use a mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. We've returned here, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Allstriker still talking with you here as we continue to transition into off-season mode, but that doesn't mean the content stops, of course. Again, still 5 days a week here on Locked On Ravens. One thing I did forget to mention in that second segment, what players were saying, Ronnie Stanley also was not questioning Lamar Jackson. He said, quote, "I want Lamar Jackson to be playing here with me. He knows that this is his team. This is his offense." Lamar Jackson, this is Lamar Jackson's locker room. It is important that Lamar Jackson is in a Ravens uniform for a very long time. And, that's my stance on it. That obviously is his teammates' stance on it, but there are plenty of questions. There are honestly more questions than answers in terms of the Ravens. There have been the reports saying that, the Ravens still plan to negotiate with him. They still view him as the long-term answer, and they're going to franchise tag him. All these reports coming out. Hopefully those are true and that he's actually in Baltimore and they can agree to give him what he's worth and also have him in Baltimore for a long time. But it just goes to show that the teammates do have Lamar Jackson's back. And that wasn't a question for me. I always thought that they did. And the Ravens also, they signed 6 players to reserve/future deals. And those 6 were wide receivers Shamar Bridges and Mike Thomas, guard John Simpson, defensive tackle Rashad Nichols, outside linebacker Jeremiah Moon, and cornerback Bo Pete Keys. So Shamar Bridges back in a Ravens uniform for now, that reserve future deal. But I do want to continue talking about, we talked about in the end of the second segment with J.K. Dobbins, because the Ravens, they have their running back by committee. I'm not trying to put shade on Gus Edwards. I think Gus Edwards is really good. And, there are people saying that the Ravens should get rid of Gus Edwards and no, he's not good anymore. To me, that's not the case whatsoever. But I do think that you don't have to go strictly full committee with these guys where it's 12 for J.K. Dobbins and 11 for Gus Edwards, or 13 for Gus Edwards and 12 for J.K. Dobbins. You can give J.K. Dobbins 20 carries and give Gus Edwards 9, and then you can give J.K. Dobbins 18 carries and give Gus Edwards 12. You can do that. You can utilize your guys, and I think it honestly helps in that way because I think in terms of, dynamic ability, J.K. Dobbins is a bit more dynamic than Gus Edwards, and I give Edwards a lot of credit, right? He has grown, I think, every single year since getting into the league. When he was undrafted out of Rutgers, he was signed by the Ravens as an undrafted guy, very north-south runner, right? That was really his game, but he has included cuts in his game. He's added receiving to his game. He can do that now. He's added elements. And so I think that having a tandem of J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards is extremely valuable, but I think you have to have your best players on the field in key moments. I do think I would favor J.K. Dobbins over Gus Edwards, but that's not to say that I don't trust Gus Edwards. I do trust Gus Edwards. But in terms of Dobbins and his workload, you're able, if you have Edwards and Dobbins in the same backfield still, and you sprinkle in Justice Hill. I think Justice Hill played great this year. I think Kenyon Drake played pretty well in his snaps as well. You're able to preserve guys for the playoffs. But then if you're not playing them in the playoffs, why aren't you giving those guys the opportunities? Tyler Huntley, I put up the stat on Twitter. I know I talked about it after the game yesterday, but I do think that the Ravens tried to use Tyler Huntley like Lamar Jackson when Tyler Huntley is not Lamar Jackson. Both are athletic quarterbacks. No, don't get me wrong, but Lamar Jackson is much more dynamic, and Huntley had that 35-yard run. He had 9 carries for 54 yards. That's 6 yards a carry. You take out that long 35-yard run, goes down to 8 carries for 19 yards, which is just over 2 yards a carry. So the Ravens, instead of giving those handoffs to Huntley or having Huntley run or giving handoffs to Mark Andrews, which, oh boy, it goes back to our change in the first segment with the offensive coordinator. You give those to Dobbins. You give those to even Edwards. You give them to Justice Hill. Those are the types of things you have to learn as an organization, where it goes back to you play the game to win the Super Bowl, right? Regular season is great. You got to get into the playoffs. You have to have that regular season success, build championship habits. But the Ravens didn't really build a lot of championship habits, especially on offense throughout the course of the season. I think on defense they did, and they learned and they grew as a unit under Mike Macdonald. But offensively, the red zone offense was not a championship red zone offense. The play calling definitely was not championship play calling. Time management definitely wasn't championship level whatsoever. So you have to learn lessons from that. You can't just look at that and say, well, all right, wild card exit again. It is what it is. The Ravens have made the wild card round twice, made the divisional round twice, and did not make the playoffs in their past 5 years with Lamar. In the 5 years with Lamar Jackson. Jackson led them to the wild card round in his rookie season, saved that year. They had the great year in 2019. They lose in the divisional round. They win the game. And I've gone through the timeline time and time again where this was AFC Championship or bust for me, and it busted. It was disappointing based off of the expectations this team had moving into the season and going into it. This team was talking Super Bowl, and it didn't happen. And I think a lot of it has to do with the habits. So I think being able to make big changes, it all goes back to what we talked about in the first segment with being able to evolve your offense, evolve your habits. That's big for me. And I think against the Bengals, we saw a team that really could have won that game. You can argue they should have won that game, but there was the 14-point swing on the failed quarterback sneak, the time management at the end of the game, the interception early by Tyler Huntley, some gash plays given up by the defense. It was little things, key penalties as well. Marcus Peters with the taunting that probably should have been an ejection, but wasn't. You have the holding on a run for some reason with under 30 seconds left in the game. You don't use your timeouts. It's things stacking on top of another. And it honestly ruined, I think, what was a pretty good performance by the defense overall. I think Mike Macdonald, all 3 games that defense played against Joe Burrow had trouble. Did he struggle the entire game each time? No. But based off what we saw last year with Don Martindale's defense and how Burrow just carved up, and that defense was injured. They were very injured. I will preface by saying that. But I think Mike Macdonald put out a great game plan. I think that Tyler Huntley did have really big moments in this game, despite having a couple of miscues. The running game, I thought, Dobbins had some plays. Demarcus Robinson just burnt Eli Apple into the shadow realm. So it was the little things that added up for them, and it ruined, I think, what could have been an all-time Baltimore upset. And that's, I think, what's frustrating to most people, because, again, it goes back to what I asked on the live stream last night, which is, would you rather have your favorite football team get blown out 40-0 and you kind of accept defeat in the first quarter where you're like, all right, it's over. Like, it's frustrating, but oh well. Or would you rather be invested and then have all these miscues in a game that that you have a chance in because it's 10-9 Ravens at halftime, and you come out and you 17-17, you're on the Bengals 1-yard line, and it's just heartbreak over and over and over again. So for Baltimore, I think that if they do make the right moves, they have a lot of potential. They have a lot of potential next year, but they have to make the right moves, maximize the roster, get Lamar Jackson under contract, in my opinion, and just make the moves to make yourselves championship contenders. Because right now, with the habits that were built, it didn't work out for them. And it was stuff over and over that we talked about here on the show, where I said this could come back to really hurt them in the playoffs. And it did. Red zone offense, time management, play calling, key penalties, all of them were major factors in why Baltimore lost that game. So hopefully those changes are on the way. And I kind of provided a mini blueprint for the Ravens offseason, something we'll be talking about for a long time throughout the course of these next couple of weeks, couple of months. As we go past the Super Bowl in a couple of weeks, we will head into free agency. Then there's the draft. And before we know it, will be the 2023 season, but a lot of offseason content to come before that. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel on YouTube. I really appreciate all the support. We'll be back here tomorrow with another episode of Locked On Ravens. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And I will see you right back here tomorrow.